If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and we are back with another discography ranking for you all. This time, we're doing a very special one. I mean, they're all very special, but you get the idea. I put up a poll back around late November, early December, that time frame, over on the community tab on my YouTube page, asking for what band would you guys like to see me rank, and it was all themed around Swedish death metal. So you had your options of At the Gates, Bloodbath, Entombed, and Hypocrisy, and by an overwhelming margin, the winner of the poll is the band that I am talking about today, and that is none other than the pioneers of Swedish death metal, and that is Entombed. I am excited to go through this band, considering kind of similar to Darkthrone to some extent. Entombed pretty much does whatever the fuck they want to do, and even after a certain period in their discography, it's like, well, who the hell knows what this next album's going to sound like. And also, just as a note, I am going to be including the 3 Entombed A.D. albums in this ranking, considering that was really the only version of Entombed that was active in recent years. So I decided to add in those 3 albums into this ranking. So it's 12 albums total, and we're going to be going over every single one of them. Now, as far as how I got into Entombed, well, I got into Entombed a little bit later. I mean, I already knew about Left Hand Path and how legendary that album was for so many fans. And I had that album for a number of years, like probably since, I want to say like 2018, 2019, I've had that album. So yeah, it was a big album for myself, and I can say the same for a lot of fans of death metal. But I didn't get into anything else from Entombed until recent times, like in the last year or two. Like, I got into a couple of the other classics, excuse me, and then going through most of the other albums in preparation for this discography ranking. But yeah, we're going to go over all 12. Let's get started. So, the story of Entombed begins out of Stockholm, Sweden in 1987, when they were originally known as Brainwarp, and then very shortly after forming, they changed their name to Nihilist. And the lineup for Nihilist consisted of Ulf Setterlund on guitars, Alex Helland on guitars, Nick Anderson on drums, Johnny Hedlund on bass, and Lars Goran Petrov, otherwise known as LG Petrov, was on vocals. So, Nihilist pretty much started a huge underground buzz in all of Sweden with their more raw, nasty, lo-fi sounding death metal through their early demo material and writing some killer fucking songs, and really laying down the groundwork for pretty much the Swedish death metal sound. The tone, the structures, the attitude. Like, there's a very punk thrash attitude in the Swedish death metal scene, and Nihilist was really the big pioneer. Yeah, you had a couple of other bands around the same time that were just starting out, but it was really Nihilist that got the ball rolling for death metal in all of Sweden. And Nihilist would be together for a couple of years. However, in 1989, Nihilist, well, they would go through an interesting time here, because there was pretty much like a spat between the rest of the band and Johnny, and what the rest of the guys pretty much did was break up Nihilist, and then a couple of days later, maybe even the next day, everybody but Johnny got back together as Nihilist. So yeah, I guess they decided to do it as a way to keep from firing Johnny. It was like, we broke up. But then they would come back the next day and reform the band without Johnny, so it's like, kind of a messy moment there. But they wouldn't keep the name Nihilist for too long after reforming. In fact, they would later on in 1989 change their name to Entombed, and eventually would record their But Life Goes On demo. And not too long after, the buzz surrounding this demo went all over the world. Entombed would get picked up by Earache Records to go into the studio to do their studio debut album. They would enter the studio in late 1989, and then released in the summer of 1990 on Earache Records, we get their debut album, Left Hand Path. Well, to quote Necrotic Nick from the Thralls of Metal, to literally the surprise of no one, this is my number one album. I mean, could it have been any other album to be number one? Granted, there are other great albums I'm going to talk about, but this was clear as day, my number one pick for this ranking, because I've talked about this album quite a bit, mostly on the Horseman podcast, but I'll go in depth here. This is arguably a top 3 death metal album, period. Like, up there with albums like Altars of Madness and Leprosy. Like, this is highly influential, not just to the whole Swedish death metal scene, but all of death metal, especially in bands today. Like, there are countless bands out there all over the world that do their best to pay homage to Entombed and the other Swedish death metal bands. Now, of course, this album would be produced, actually this and the following 3 albums after this would all be produced by Thomas Skogsberg, which, if you are a fan of Swedish death metal, he is a huge name because he was essentially the Scott Burns of Sweden, where Scott Burns would be the guy that most of the American bands, particularly the Florida bands, would go to record. Thomas Skogsberg was like the guy to work on anything for death metal or related to death metal during the early to mid-90s. But all these songs on this album just absolutely kill. Tracks like the title track, which is one of the greatest death metal songs of all time, especially the bridge when they do the score to Phantasm, absolutely fitting with that haunting, creepy, almost melodic atmosphere of the song. Like, also, I could look at this album as kind of laying a little bit of the groundwork for the eventual melodic death metal sound, because there are some great melodies on this album, but it's all about the raw aggression that this album has. Punky D beats, a ton of thrash influence all throughout this album. Other great songs I absolutely love on here: Drowned, Abnormally Deceased, Supposed to Rot, Bitter Loss, But Life Goes On, Premature Autopsy. Like, top to bottom, no wasted moment on this album. Every song is a hit. It's all a hit album right here. And also, I mean, just look at that album cover. One of the best album covers in death metal history, done by the legendary Dan Seagrave. So, what more could you ask there? But yeah, hands down my number one album. This is an all-time influential album, not just to death metal, but all of metal. The Boss Heavy Metal 2 guitar pedal, just one of the best guitar tones in the history of music. That buzzsaw tone. Yeah, and just like Necrotic Nick, I am also a big slut for that tone, so there you have it. But yeah, Left Hand Path, my number one. But like I said, this album would become legendary really quickly, and in 1991, they were set to do a show while touring with Unleashed in Sweden. They were set to open for Morbid Angel, but due to a bus accident with Morbid Angel had to cancel their part of the show. So kind of a big hit to Entombed right there, because they were big fans of Morbid Angel. But as they were touring, they would eventually pick up bassist Lars Rosenberg, who came from bands like Therion and Carbonized. He would come on to become the new bass player for Entombed, since on Left Hand Path, both Nick and Ulf did the bass parts on the album. Now, sometime in 1991, there would be a personal spat between LG and the rest of the band, and LG would end up being fired. And for this next album, they would go back to Sunlight Studios to work with Thomas Skogsberg once again. Although, as far as who would be on vocals, Nick would take over the vocals on this album, but for the tour, they would get Johnny Dordevic from Carnage to do the live vocals for the first part of the touring for this next album. But released in late fall 1991 or in the early winter of 1992, would be the release of Clandestine. This is my number 2 album. This album is almost as good as Left Hand Path. I would say almost, but there are some differences on this album compared to Left Hand Path. Still has the HM2 tone, however, they tune their guitars up a little bit, where on Left Hand Path it was tuned down to B. This album would be tuned up to C tuning to kind of give it a more sinister sounding vibe out of all these songs. And while I like Nick's vocals on this album, I prefer LG more than Nick when it comes to Entombed vocals, but Nick does a great job. Also, big differences with this album compared to Left Hand Path. There's a little bit more melody going on, as well as more groove-oriented songs. Like tracks like Stranger Aeons have some really cool groove pockets going on, but it still has plenty of the punk influence and the thrash influence. Songs like Living Dead and Living Dead with those like thrash influences just kind of just really coming out into your ears and just unleashing pure heavy insert any adjective you can think of for amazement. But even other great songs like Chaos Breed, Sinners Bleed, Severe Burns, which was actually a song from the Nihilist days, re-recorded for this album. Crawl is a fantastic track. Like, again, another classic album, top to bottom, not a wasted moment. Can't go wrong with it. It's my number 2. Now, after the first part of the touring for Clandestine, Johnny would leave the band and LG would return after they mended fences and got back on track, and even did the Gods of Grind tour, I believe, with Carcass, Cathedral, and Confessor, which that was a pretty big European tour for Entombed at that point. And then they would go back to the studio in 1992, early 1993, and they had a different sound in mind for this next album. They wanted to incorporate some different influences on this album, like exploring a little more of the punk rock elements, but also with some more classic rock and roll, hard rock, and groove metal influences. And this was around the time when groove metal was becoming a big phenomenon because of Pantera. So Entombed decided to take all those elements and combine them with their classic death metal sound, and released in October of 1993, we would get Wolverine Blues. This is my number 3 album. I really enjoy this album. I know this one's kind of divisive among a lot of hardcore fans because, yeah, they moved away from their classic punky, thrashy death metal sound of the first 2 albums and decided to change up their sound, but it wasn't too much of a radical change, because there were moments on Clandestine that kind of felt like they could have fit on this album, for sure. Like, again, with those grooves and the slower sections. But on here, they get a little more hardcore at times, combining that with the more rock and roll style and the groove metal of the Pantera mixed in with the death metal stylings. But the opening track, I Master, I thought that could have been a song off of Clandestine. It's still very thrash forward, very much death metal. And then as the album progresses, you still get some death metal moments, but obviously you get all these other influences coming in. Other great tracks like the title track, which is just 2+ minutes, but it's a catchy song. Rotten Soil, Contempt, Full of Hell, Blood Song is pretty catchy. Out of Hand, Heavens Die, Hollow Man. Top to bottom, this is another great album. I understand why this album is so divisive, because Entombed decided to move away from what they were good at and try something different, but this band, kind of like Darkthrone, likes to experiment a lot with their influences in order to see what works and what doesn't. And this was an example of experimentation working out just fine. Yeah, there might be a couple of tracks like Demon and songs like Demon and maybe even a little bit of Hollow Man didn't care too much for, but most of this album's fucking kick ass. Especially, like I said, I Mastered, the title track, Blood Song, Out of Hand, Heavens Die. I think those were the big standouts on here. But yeah, this album, my number 3. So, during this time, whenever Wolverine Blues came out, it was reviewed very well by a lot of critics and such. Excuse me. And they actually wound up getting a short-lived record deal with Columbia Records to have the Marvel character Wolverine appear on the album covers on some of the editions, even though the band's like, the album is not about him, but whatever. But yeah, that was pretty cool that happened. But despite all the momentum built from Wolverine Blues and even the first two albums, they decided to leave Earache Records, which, knowing what I know about Earache Records, they were probably in the right to leave Earache, considering Earache's kind of shat on some bands. And also, they kind of like to shit on people when it comes to merch. I'm still waiting on an order from you, Earache. I ordered from you back in December when you had a sale, and I still haven't heard if it's shipped out or not, or it's even gotten here. So yeah, think twice about fucking with me. But I digress. So, after leaving Earache Records, they would try and shop around for different labels, and eventually they would just form their own label called Three Man Recordings and would be distributed by larger labels, most notably Music for Nations. They would get back to the studio in 1996, the summer of 96, once again with Thomas Skogsberg over at Sunlight, and in March of 1997 we would get the release of DCLXVI, which is 666 in Roman numerals, but it also means to ride, shoot straight, and speak the truth. This album's my number 9. There are individual songs I do like on this album, like the title track, Damn Deal Done, which is a very catchy song. That opening riff, one of the catchiest Entombed riffs, I would say. But yeah, there are some decent songs on here, but the two standouts, like I said, are the title track and Damn Deal Done. But this album is just weird, and largely because this would continue in that death and roll vein that started on Wolverine Blues, but the death metal influence was a lot less on this album. This felt more like a sludge metal album than it did a death metal album. And like LG's vocals really shifted on this album. Like you could hear him shift a little bit during Wolverine Blues, but they really shifted here. Like he had more of like a hardcore bark to his growl on this album. And also the production, not the best. Not the best production at all. And I forgot to mention that before this album was recorded, Lars Rosenberg left the band and would be replaced by Jorgen Sandström, formerly of Grave, to play bass. Almost forgot about that little tidbit right there. But yeah, this album, just really odd, and also the guitar tone, it's like it still has the HM2 tone, but they put so much gain and sizzle on the guitars that it's almost painful to listen to. And yeah, just not my favorite. But it's definitely not terrible. It's an okay album with some pretty good songs here and there. It's just overall very much an inconsistent. It's like a lot of peaks and valleys and so on and so forth. And not in a good way. It wasn't like a good roller coaster ride. It was just like, can we just have something consistent on here? And it didn't happen. But regardless, this album is my number 9. So, moving away from DCLXVI, we would get more lineup changes, and one of the big lineup changes, Nick Anderson would leave the band so he could focus primarily on his rock band, the Helicopters, which is pretty cool, and replacing him on drums would be Peter Stjarnvin, formerly of Merciless, and also would play in Unanimated. He would come in to take over on drums going forward for quite a while, and they would get back to the studio in the summer of 1998, and they would not go to Thomas Skogsberg. They would actually work with a producer named Daniel Ray, mostly known for working with Ramones and White Zombie. And, well, released in November of 1998, Entombed completely fucked over their fans with the release of Same Difference. This is clearly my dead last album. Just one phrase to describe this album. what the fuck happened? Like, okay, to kind of lay the table out, late 90s, while I did say in my last video, or one of my last videos talking about amazing 90s death metal debuts, people wanted to say that death metal faded into obscurity by this point, which I've said it once and I'll say it again. It's somewhat true, but at the same time, it's extremely hyperbolic. Granted, if you were playing death metal during this time period, some people might have looked at you as a bit of a dinosaur, perhaps, because it was around this time nu metal was really big, and Entombed, I assume, probably saw what was going on statewide, over in the States, with alternative metal and nu metal really kind of taking over, and not in the best way. They thought, okay, we need to try and be relevant. How do we stay relevant in a time like this? So they pretty much wrote an alternative metal album. Like, this album feels like something you would have heard from bands like Helmet, Clutch, or maybe even like, I don't know, COC, possibly. Like, this feels more like those than it does Entombed. Like, there is nothing Entombed about this album whatsoever. And LG's vocals, they stick out like a sore thumb because everybody's like, hey, we're going to try an alternative metal sound. LG's thinking, have you guys heard me? This will not fucking work. And yeah, this album's terrible. Nothing redeeming about it. So I'm just going to move on while I'm there. So, after that shit period where they just lost all of their momentum, and even the band hated Same Difference themselves, so there you go with that. And because of the ill reception of Same Difference, they decided, we got something to prove. We need to get our shit together. And they would get back to the studio in 1999 and would actually begin a long relationship with one Nico Elgstrand. He would be the producer of this album and even produce quite a few others later on, and pretty much stays within the Entombed conversation for the rest of the video. He would take over the production helm for this next album, and this album would be recorded, mixed, and mastered in about 18 to 21 days. Released in March of 2000, we would get the unleashing of Uprising. Excuse me. Uprising is my number 5 album. This is the return to the death and roll sound, but it's properly done. Kind of like Wolverine Blues Part 2, I would say, this album. But it's also more sludgy, I would say, than Wolverine Blues. Like, I think there's more sludge metal influence going on throughout this album. But yeah, top to bottom, there is just some fun stuff on here. Songs like Satan Slugs, Won't Back Down, Scottish Hell, which is a really cool cover of a Dead Horse song. Year In, Year Out is really entertaining. Something Out of Nothing actually brings back more of the death metal influence with a nice triplet chug section. And then the closing track, In the Flesh, arguably the most doom-laden Entombed song. Like, it's pretty slow and kind of has a little bit of like a heavier Black Sabbath feel going on. But yeah, and I just love how they just decide to make this sound gritty. It's muddy, but muddy in the best way possible. Like, it's just all about unleashing aggression and showing to everybody that they lost after Same Difference, that, hey, we're coming back to what you like, so stick around and you might love us again. And Uprising was definitely an album to kind of bring them back to a more positive forefront a little bit within death metal, death and roll, sludge, what have you. But yeah, Uprising, my number 5. Now, it was after Uprising was released, they would tour for a little bit and actually get to open for Iron Maiden in the UK and Canada, which had to have been really, really cool for Entombed to get to open for a legendary band like Iron Maiden. But the momentum was carried over so well from Uprising, they decided to get back to the studio sometime in late 2000 and went back to Nico pretty quick to record the follow-up. And released September 3rd, 2001, we would get Morningstar. Holy shit, this album is my number 4. I actually like this a lot more than Uprising, and it's simply because pretty much the death and roll is, for the most part, gone on this album. This album feels more like straight up death metal, but with a lot of thrash and sludge metal influence attached. Like, there's still some groovier tracks, but there are some thrashy barn burners on here. Songs like Eye for an Eye, Out of Heaven, Year One Now, About to Die. I might be wrong about Out of Heaven, but yeah, like Eye for an Eye, About to Die, Year One Now are such thrashy tracks. And like Year One Now, almost 2 minutes, but it's a brutal 2 minutes. But even a lot of the other songs with that more kind of sludgy groove, like the opening track, Chief Rebel Angel, one of my favorites off of this album, and actually in the lyrics has a lot of lines lifted from The Devil's Advocate, which I guess the band was big fans of that movie. But yeah, this was a hell of a comeback, I feel, for them. Well, Uprising kind of started the comeback trend. Morningstar, I think, completely solidified it. And yeah, with them bringing in that thrash influence and more of the sludge on top of a straight-up death metal style. Granted, LG's vocals were more, again, like hardcore sludgy barks, but it really works on this album. But yeah, this is a hell of an album. Great return to the death metal proper, but with some of those nuances in their songwriting, and it is my number 4. So the momentum kept going for them after the release of Morningstar, and they would go back to the studio in 2003. And this time the producer would be a gentleman named Pelle Gunnerfeld, otherwise known as Wigwam. I don't get that. And released in August of 2003, we would get Inferno. Well, I just have one question, and that's what the fuck happened again? I mean, it's not same difference bad. I don't think this is necessarily a bad album. It's just mediocre, average at best. This album is my number 11. I'm not the biggest fan of this album. Like, the mix of this album is pretty terrible. And it's muddy, but not the good muddy that Uprising was. It's just this album was poorly mixed. But there are a couple of decent songs, like the opening track, Retaliation, I do think is a really good song. But nothing much else about this album really grabbed me. But also, the big problem with this album, the dumb lyrics start popping in for Entombed, and oh my god, what in the hell were they thinking with the lyrics on this? Like, especially the most infamous song of this album is Flexing Muscles. Literally, there is a song called Flexing Muscles, and there's a line in the song that goes, "Jerking off while flexing!" And it's like, I don't want to hear about you masturbating at the gym, dude, okay? It's just, what the fuck was this? What the fuck is this? What the fuck is this? But, yeah, it's not a god-awful album. It's just, this album feels like what would have happened if they wrote this album in between Uprising and Morningstar, but just dumbed everything down to its lowest common denominator element, and it just, yeah, mix is bad, lyrics are stupid, couple of okay to good songs, like I said, Retaliation, but other than that, nothing much else, and it is my number 11. So, yeah, needless to say, wasn't a big fan. But moving on from that, the band would continue to tour. However, couple of lineup shifts would happen. In 2004, Jorgen Sandstrom would leave the band, and Nico Elkstrand would step in to play bass. But also, around this time period in the mid-2000s, Ulf Sederlund would end up leaving the band, and an original member would leave, so therefore that would leave Alex Hellid to take over on everything with guitars. And in 2006, Peter Stjarnvin would end up leaving and be replaced by Ola Dahlstedt on drums. And in 2006, they did release an EP called Win and Sodom, which actually sounds like old Entombed. It sounded like they were about ready to try and get back to the Left Hand Path and Clandestine sound of the band. And then they would go back to the studio in 2006, 2007, Nico Elkstrand back on production duties, and released in June of 2007 on Candlelight Records this time, would be the release of Serpent Saints, The 10 Amendments. This album is my number 10. This album, to me, it's like it was an attempt to get back to the Left Hand Path and Clandestine sound. Like, the HM2 tone is back, but it's very thin, and there's a lot of this album that feels more like crust punk than it does death metal. Though a couple of songs actually aren't bad. Songs like Masters of Death, where they name drop Morbid Angel, Napalm Death, which I thought was SOD, they even name drop. So many bands. Like, they would just talk about all of death metal and extreme metal as a whole in the lyrics. And that song is good. And even songs like In the Blood and When in Sodom are decent. But the album as a whole just kind of, and I'll agree with Necrotic Nick on this, it does come off like a dumb version of Left Hand Path. And also, the dumb lyrics continue, especially the line of, "You wanna bite my cock on a muck? I do not want to bite your cock. I am not gay." So there you go. No offense to gay people, but don't ask me to be involved in your activities. But yeah, this album, number 10, just very uneven, and kind of another way to describe it is the band seemed to struggle on what direction this album should go. And it just didn't work. Like, I appreciate their intention to try and get back to the old school sound, but it just was not approached very well at all. And that's why it's my number 10. But now we're about to head into the AD part, but before we get to the AD part, we would have a member added in 2010. Victor Brandt from Aeon would come in to play bass while Nico would switch to guitars. And then we get to 2014, or 2013, 2014, that time frame. There would be a big legal dispute between LG Petrov and Alex Helid over the rights to the name Entombed. And in the court cases, Alex would end up winning the name Entombed, so LG would end up having to make up his own band called Entombed A.D. And because of legal reasons, that's why the AD part was added. Because it was around this time LG was negotiating with Century Media Records, having Century Media be ready to release new Entombed, but that was before the court case issue started and Alex winning the name Entombed. But regardless as to how you feel about the whole court case situation going down the way it did, LG would get himself, Nico, Victor, and Ole to come in to form Entombed A.D. to kind of try and keep the brand going forward. And for this next album, Nico would co-produce along with Roberto Laghi, so they would produce this album together, and released on Century Media Records in August of 2014 would be Back to the Front. This is my number 8 album. I actually think this is a decent album. Like, the HM2 tone continues, although it's a little bit too fuzzed out on this album. Like, it feels a little more warm and fuzzy than aggressive and uncomfortable, the way I like the HM2 tone to be. But there were some pretty good tracks on here. Songs like Bait and Bleed, Waiting for Death, Soldier of No Fortune, Second to None. Some really good tracks on this album, but I feel like they were experimenting at this point. It still has some of the death and roll elements on here, but it's still got plenty of traditional death metal on top that feels like a mix of the two. But I think it was maybe like 55% death and roll, 45% death metal. But still, it was like a nice kind of change up in comparison to the previous two Entombed albums, kind of trying to get things back on track for the Entombed A.D. brand going forward. But yeah, it's a solid album, and it's my number 8. But moving on from that, pretty much within a year and a half, we would get yet another Entombed A.D. album. This time there would be an ensemble of producers, such as Nico, once again, but you also have Tom Van Hessich. I probably said that wrong. And Tom would actually, most notably, got to work with Apocalyptica. And then the third producer coming in would be one Jacob Hellner, most famous for producing pretty much everything Rammstein ever did. So it would be Tom, Nico, and Jacob working together for the production on this next album. And released in February of 2016, we would get Dead Dawn. Now, this album's kind of complicated for me. I believe I reviewed this album when it came out, and I kind of shat on it. I was not a huge fan of this album when it came out, but going back, it's a lot better than I remember it to being. And in fact, it is a lot better. This album is my number 7. Much better than Back to the Front. Actually, I'll say this is a good album. Like, it's definitely pushing more towards the death metal side. There's still some death and roll laced in here, but there's more thrash coming back, more traditional death metal. Like, they're starting to transition away from the death and roll sound and going back to the death metal stylings of the early Entombed days. But yeah, songs like Down the Mars to Ride, Total Death is fucking fantastic. The Winner is Lost, Black Survival, Midas in Reverse. Like, there are some fantastic songs on here. But yeah, you do have a couple of filler tracks on here. Songs like Hubris, Fall, and Not What It Seems, The Closer. Not the best songs. They were decent, but there was plenty of great songs on this album. And it was like, looking back on it, I don't know what I was thinking whenever I first heard this album back when it came out in 2016, and why I put it in my worst albums of 2016 list. Like, hello, McFly. Now with my better musical ears, I can appreciate this album a whole hell of a lot more, and I can say this is actually a good album. Not great, but good. And it was a step in the right direction for Entombed A.D. going forward. My number 7. Now, the next couple of years would be kind of busy for LG, because not only was he trying to balance his time with Entombed A.D., but he also had another project called Firespawn, which was mostly like a supergroup featuring members of Grave and Necrophobic, which was actually a pretty cool project. I remember hearing a couple of songs, and it was really cool from what I heard. But Entombed A.D. would get back to the studio sometime in early 2019, and we would get another lineup change. Victor Brandt would leave the band and be replaced by Tobias Christensen for the live bass. Meanwhile, Nico's still on guitars, and then they would get another live guitarist, Gilherme Miranda, to come in for second guitars, and the producers for this would be just Nico and Jacob Hellner. And released in late August of 2019, we would get the final album of the Entombed A.D. lineup, and that's Bowels of Earth. This is my number 6, and holy shit, this is a great album. If I were to redo my 2019 album of the year list, this I think would have been a little higher, like top 20 for me. This was a fantastic album. This album felt like a proper return to the Left Hand Path and Clandestine era. Little bits of the Wolverine Blues influence, but that's mostly in the groove. Like, this is not a death and roll album. This is just straight up death metal with some elements of thrash. Some of the punk is back. Little bit of the groove left over from Clandestine and Wolverine Blues, but done very well. Top to bottom, this is an awesome album. Torment Remains, that felt like something you would have heard on Left Hand Path or Clandestine. It is thrashy, it is brutal. The title track is fantastic. Bourbon Nightmare, Elimination was great. Fit for a King, and even there are 2 cover songs covering Hank Williams' I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive and Motorhead's Back at the Funny Farm. Really cool covers, and then the song To Eternal Night, a little bit of the Doom comes in, which was really cool to hear. So, yeah, top to bottom, this was a hell of a way to close it out for LG. Like, holy shit, this was a hell of an album. And maybe if I keep listening to it, this album might go higher on my list as the years go on, but for now, it rests as my number 6. And like I said, that would pretty much be the final Entombed A.D. album, because sadly, 2 years ago, March of 2021, we lost LG Petrov to bile duct cancer, and so missed, because looking back, he was one of my favorite death metal vocalists, especially for his work on Left Hand Path. And from what I've heard, one of the smiliest and funniest people in metal, like a metal spirit animal, similar to, say, Michael Ockerfeld or Abath, you know, like that kind of guy. So, yeah, we miss him so much, and may he rest in peace, God rest his soul. But despite that being the end of Entombed A.D., there is still another version of Entombed out there. They do have a lineup, and there's been rumors that they would record together, but that remains a mystery, and who knows if we'll get another Entombed album, because that lineup has pretty much most of the original guys, Alex, Ulf, Nick, and a couple of other people, so who knows if we get another album from the actual Entombed. But the legacy that Entombed and Entombed A.D. had left behind was one of the greatest death metal bands in the early 90s, pioneering so much. The guitar tone of the Swedish sound, so many bands today adopting that tone to keep it going. And like I said, they were not afraid to take chances, though there were a couple times where they should have been scared. But starting the Swedish death metal sound and death and roll started with them, which, yeah, very small subgenre, but still, it's there, and Entombed is the band to thank for it. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching this ranking of all things Entombed. As far as what's going to be the next album ranking, next month, February, I'm going to be ranking Avenged Sevenfold. I can't wait to do that one. I've been waiting to do that one for a long time, and yeah, that's going to be fun. But until then, horns high. See you guys later.